Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen announced at a national security conference on December 27th the return to a 1 year from the current 4-month mandatory military service. She explained that this is a difficult but a very important and necessary step in bolstering Taiwan's defense capabilities, noting that only preparing for war will help avoid war and safeguarding the country's democracy.
而台湾就处在威权主义扩张的第一线，守在全球民主防线的最前线，备战才能够避战。
Hi, and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Annie Kuhl.
I'm Rath Wang. Joining us in the studio today is Charles Wu, Associate Professor of the Department of Diplomacy at National Chengchi University, and Lev Nachman, Assistant Professor in the College of Social Sciences, also at National Chengchi University. Lev has a Ph.D. in political science at the University of California, Irvine. Both are experts in international relations, particularly between Taiwan, the U.S., and China. A very warm welcome back to both on the show today. I also spoke earlier to Democratic Progressive Party, DPP Legislator Lo Chih-cheng, the convener of the legislature's Foreign and National Defense Committee, who also serves as the DPP's International Affairs Director. And I spoke earlier to Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, based in Washington, D.C., who is also an expert in East Asian and Korean defense. Cronin is a frequent commentator in South Korea's Donga Ilbo and the Singaporean Straits Times. Apart from the extension of conscripts will be undergoing more intense training, including shooting exercises, combat instruction used by U.S. forces, and operating more powerful weapons. Charles, I believe you also served in the military. How long was that?
Yes, it's a very interesting experience for me. 15 years ago, I served in the Army. Since it's mandatory, all the Taiwanese guys need to serve in the Army. At the time, I spent about 1.5 years in the Army. However, it was 16-month training. The training including, for example, the shooting training and the very basic military training. And I still remember we spent 6 times on the shooting training. But we only have like prone shooting positions. We cannot either using the standing or the kneeling down positions. I still believe Taiwanese students, young people, they need to have this kind of trainings more often.
So would you say the trainings back then compared to the trainings nowadays, they're really very different?
It's because of the time difference. At the time, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Taiwan and China, we still have kind of not very, the relationship was not that intense.
Right, right.
Right now, we have facing more kind of threats from cross-strait. So I think we still need this kind of extension of the military service. Right?
Even then, you thought it wasn't enough. So, Lev, at its longest, it was actually 2.5 years, and now they're bringing it back to 1 year. Do you feel that there's still a gap, even increasing it to 1 year?
So I think at the very least, 1 year is a needed beginning. 4 months is too little. And I think there's been talk for a long time about the need for some sort of reform to this program. And I think starting with 1 year is a reasonable start. Ultimately, what we're going to need to see is what exactly this 1 year training program looks like.
Right.
And until we have more details and until the first few cohorts go through this program, that's really going to be when we can look back and say, okay, is 1 year enough? Is it too little, too much? Do we need to add more? And these kinds of affiliated questions. But really, ultimately, what I think everyone is very eager to see is what this plan is going to look like.
So I feel like people in Taiwan were all waiting, and we're all waiting to see what's going to be looking like in the future. But President Tsai also mentioned earlier in the announcement that Russian-Ukrainian war has not ended, even after over 300 days. So Charles, I'm going to come back to you for a little bit here. Why do you think that she drew comparisons with Ukraine?
I think Taiwan and Ukraine have some similarity. Even people say Taiwan is not Ukraine. However, we have some similarity in geopolitical and also in a great power positions. For example, we're facing the authoritarian expansion. It's very real. So Taiwan needs to prepare any kind of this kind of potential attacks in the future. However, I always say the better methods to prevent a war is you need to strengthen the deterrence. Okay, how to deter the enemy to initiate attacks against you is a very important question, because we can see Ukraine, they try to deter Putin to attack. However, the deterrence failed. So the first question we need to ask about deterrence is, if the deterrence failed, what can we do? So this is also a very important international topic, not only in Taiwan, it's between the United States and Taiwan. How to strengthen Taiwanese military capabilities, especially how can we develop our asymmetric capabilities. We are not trying to buy this kind of gigantic big weapons, expensive weapons, which is malleable. We need to equip ourselves with more missiles, mid-range, short-range missiles. And also how to train Taiwanese people using, we call the Stingers, like this kind of portable missile systems.
Which the U.S. seems to be working with Taiwan on.
Yeah, they're working on that, but still a long way to go. And also, I think how to equip Taiwan and help Taiwan by military loans is a very important issue. Later on, we're going to discuss about this one.
Right.
So, like what I say, we always need to prepare if the deterrence failed. The next step, what we can do. And this is also a very important topic for Taiwanese, all the people in Taiwan.
And also, Lev, what is your take on this? As a foreigner over here, do you also think that probably Taiwan may be on the brink of the war, just like Ukraine and Russia?
I don't think we're on the brink of war. I don't think war is coming today or tomorrow for a number of reasons. Like Professor Wu said, Taiwan is not Ukraine. There's important geopolitical similarities, but there's also very important geopolitical differences. She is not signaling that invasion is imminent. And even though we hear lots of timelines and deadlines, these revolve more around capability instead of intent. And this difference between capability and intent is an important one, and one that is kind of often overlooked. So, even though we know that they are building up the capability to invade, that's the reason why Taiwan needs to strengthen its own deterrence capabilities as well. Because while the PRC is building up its own military, Taiwan needs to respond in kind by saying we are also taking more defensive preventative measures on our own end.
And is this signaling that Taiwan is taking those measures necessary for its self-defense?
Right. So, not just Ukraine, but also, ever since Nancy Pelosi's visit, we've seen a qualitative and quantitative increase in the types of military threats from the PRC towards Taiwan.
Right.
That this signals to the United States to say, look, if we're going to continue this relationship with Taiwan, we need to see that Taiwan is also taking actions on their own end. Regardless of what happens in Ukraine, it's important for the United States to see that Taiwan is taking active measures for deterrence on its own and not just purely relying on United States support. And I think this is a very important signal, not just to Beijing that Taiwan takes deterrence seriously, but also to the United States that it takes deterrence seriously.
But do you think this action may also provoke China even more than before?
It's possible, but it's important to remember that any action is going to provoke the PRC.
Right.
It's more about making calculated decisions that if we know everything is going to provoke, then we got to make sure that the decisions we're making we're getting the most out of them. And this kind of extension to the 1-year military service, I think, is a good one because it both strengthens Taiwan's deterrence, even though it is inevitably going to provoke the PRC to some degree.
Speaking of provoking China, Charles, do you feel that the PRC has reacted as expected, or do you feel there's a mute or a less reaction to what people have expected?
There's always a debate who initiated this kind of expansion first.
Right.
From Chinese side, they thought it's American stepped into the East Asian politics. The United States want to hold hand in hand with democratic allies, create some this kind of security dilemma to China. But for the United States, they say, oh, China, you are starting your great zone strategy. You start this kind of threat to Taiwan. So when we get into these issues, we go back to realist ideas. People struggle for the survival, pay attention to the politics and power. So I think the best way is, first, we need to sit down and talk using communications. Communication is the best way to lower down, we call the escalation. Conflict escalation.
Talking, you mean China and Taiwan?
Yes.
Do you believe that this communication may happen, or it will really bring peace in the long run?
It depends on whom, first. Whom start the talk.
Right.
Okay, the DPP government, they are thinking about initiating, or they want to resume to the talk. However, Beijing seems like they don't want to talk this one anymore. It's the same thing. If the opposition party can come back to the power, whether they will open the communication channel, we can see. Okay.
Perhaps a new 92 consensus without the baggage of that.
Yeah, we don't know. The 92 consensus right now is not consensus in Taiwan anymore. Probably they need to think a new, this kind of new strategy or new, we call dialogue.
So I think I wanted to also mention a part that because Lev also mentioned earlier, whether it's extending the conscription period or any other actions we're taking, it is going to eventually provoke PRC, right? But then Charles also stated that it's very important that we sit down both parties and we have a peaceful communication. So under the circumstance that we may be provoking China at any minute, any time, what do you think, both of you, perspective, and how we can take the initial step to really, what can we do to really start a communication process?
So it's very frustrating from Taiwan's perspective because Tsai has tried to engage with the PRC over her tenure and has been met with silence from the PRC. From the PRC's perspective, any DPP politician, regardless of their politics, is a non-starter. Even though President Tsai has been nothing but a very moderate, pragmatic president, right. The PRC has still kind of shut the door at any chance of communication. So instead, what we look to are proxies for Taiwan to communicate on its behalf, like the United States. So recently, we've seen Xi Jinping and President Biden have some amount of dialogue, and we know that Taiwan was talked about. So even though this is not as good as Taiwan and the PRC talking directly, at the very least, this lets us know that there's a floor that we're standing on, that these leaders are communicating with each other, and that at the very least, the United States and the PRC's intentions are hopefully known to each other.
Right. And Charles?
I think Washington also want the Taiwan side should be a stable and also responsible stakeholder. Okay, they also want Taiwan and Beijing can maintain peaceful relations. So no matter who will be the 2024 presidents, Washington, they will pay more attention to cross relations. They don't want a real troublemaker, got elected in Taiwan in the future, which I think Washington, they want to grab the power on the Sino-US relations. Okay, so like what I say, when the Sino-US relations become more intense, Taiwan has more passive, not active, more passive positions. This is why I always argue Taiwan probably need to have a better hedging strategy when the Sino-US relations get in downward spirals.
And you don't see any trend to kind of come back to any sort of normalcy between between the US and China?
Let's see, now we have more stories coming between China and the United States. They are talking about climate change issues, they're talking about labor issues, they're talking about even now the pandemic issue.
So you're saying it's actually warming up?
It's warming up. They are trying to cooperate in some lower politics arenas. Okay, higher politics, probably they still have different ideas.
Right.
The Taiwan Strait, the cross-strait relations is a red line for China and the United States. I don't think they want to touch it anymore when they deal with lower politics issues.
So we just talked about how the Taiwan government is extending military conscription back to 1 year from 4 months to enhance its defense capabilities and mount an effective deterrence against the Chinese invasion. Coming up next, we will hear from legislator Lo Chih-cheng from the ruling DPP party. The legislator is also the convener of the legislature's Foreign and National Defense Committee. He speaks about the necessity of this move in bolstering the country's self-defense and signaling to the world that Taiwan is determined to defend itself.
Welcome back to the show. Let's now hear from Lo Chih-cheng, DPP legislator and convener of the legislature's Foreign and National Defense Committee. He spoke to me earlier about why the extension is crucial to Taiwan's self-defense, the consensus in Taiwan's legislature for this difficult decision, and what message this sends to the world. Let's take a look. Legislator, if conscription is extended to a year, what measures does the legislator need to take in terms of party consensus and making sure the right policies are in place?
We just have to take note of it. So there will be no public hearings. There won't be any voting on the decision. So the decision will be valid right away after the executive yuan passed it.
How do you believe conscription from 4 months to 1 year will enhance Taiwan's defense capabilities?
Obviously, we change our force structure. In other words, there will be a defense forces in defending the homeland. And the conscriptions will be basically focusing on that particular area. And more importantly, we are trying to increase our defense capabilities. And by extending the conscription system from 4 months to 1 year, will be definitely strengthen our deterrence.
Will they work with civil groups such as with the Taiwan Forward Alliance?
I think most importantly, it will send a very strong signal to the other side of Taiwan Strait, but also to other countries that Taiwan is very determined and very committed to our own defense. So that is the most important thing. But more importantly, in the face of the rising China's military activities, in the face of China's rising threat, it's very important for us to beef up our defense.
We've also seen the American Institute in Taiwan come right out to congratulate and also send their support in terms of this change. Are there more initiatives with the U.S. and working on with this 1-year extension?
In terms of how to train our soldiers, we've been learning from other countries as to how they train their soldiers, especially for the Americans. They've been fighting in real wars. So their experiences are very enlightening, very helpful for us to develop our own programs of training our soldiers.
And in terms of the substantial training, as you mentioned, will the U.S. will be sending troops or sending their military training support to
I don't
help?
think they will be sending their troops or soldiers to help Taiwan, but obviously their experiences and their module of training their soldiers will be useful for us to copy and to learn.
So there will be trainers, not troops in terms of defense, but in terms of training.
In terms of programs, there will be a huge cooperation between the two sides, but I don't think there will be any soldiers sent from the States to Taiwan.
Legislator, how imminent is the threat in the Taiwan Strait? Are we in the 11th hour?
China's threat to Taiwan has been there all the time, although there are different speculations about the imminency of China's threat. But I don't think the threat is imminent, but we had to prepare ourselves for the worst case scenario. So in other words, we had to stand by all the time, put ourselves on guard in the face of rising China's threat. But I don't think the threat is imminent right now.
Not imminent, but has it risen in the past year or so?
That's right. That's right. And as China has been increasing its military deployments on the other side of Taiwan Strait. So obviously, China is preparing itself for the eventuality of this kind of invasion.
So, Legislator, you see this as a move in response to the Chinese increasing military action?
It's not a response to just recent so-called tension in the Taiwan Strait. It's a response to a long-term trend of China's increasing military activities.
So in the end, this message is for China, so that Taiwan is ready to defend the homeland and the country's sovereignty.
By enhancing our capability of defending our homeland, we send a signal to Beijing that they had to think twice before they rushed to the conclusion that they had to invade Taiwan. So deterrence is the key word. To make sure that we have credible and robust deterrence, we have to make sure that we are capable to defend our country.
As you mentioned, to have them think twice before taking any action.
Yeah, that's right. So deterrence is in the minds of the leaders in Beijing. So we had to add more factors that China's leaders have to take into account when they make that rush conclusion and decision.
So you just heard legislator Lo Chih-cheng spoke to Rath on how the extension tells the world that Taiwan is determined to the country's self-defense. He also talked about increased cooperation between Taiwan's armed forces and the U.S. military and focusing on homeland defense. So Lev, I want to switch to you quickly. As we're seeing here from President Tsai's announcement and recent and current military reform, do you think Taiwan is enough at this point of time to withstand a potential Chinese attack by, let's say, 2027? Or do you think, of course, there's other measures that's very important to take?
Whether or not it's enough or not enough, I think is contingent upon so many variables, but I think instead it's important to focus on what programs are we looking at. Mm-hmm. So the fact that conscription is a priority these days is a good sign. Mm-hmm. The fact that Taiwan is looking back at what kinds of military packages it's purchasing from the US mm-hmm. is a good sign. The fact that US-Taiwan relations are still as rock solid as they have been in spite of growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait is a good sign. Mm-hmm. So, this doesn't mean that Taiwan is guaranteed going to be able to defend itself in the event of some sort of military conflict. But at the very least, Taiwan is actively working on the key programs it needs to in order to make sure that in the next 5 and the next 10 years, it does have meaningful abilities to defend itself.
Mm-hmm. Like you said earlier, it's not just about what they do. Most importantly, it's about the content and also the programs. Like, for instance, maybe a continuous collateral and also allies with the U.S. So how do you think the help from U.S. could also be, increasing in responding to increasing Chinese tension?
Right. So, it's important that, so much these days we talk about the military, and obviously military capabilities are a key part of deterrence, mm-hmm. but it's not the only way to deter threats. Mm-hmm. So, it's important for the United States to also think about, and not just the United States, but, all allies of Taiwan to think about other ways to help Taiwan internationally. So things like advocating for meaningful participation in international organizations like the WHO, increasing trade with Taiwan, making sure that trade cooperations are increasing and not decreasing. These are all key ways that we can help add to this kind of big outcome of deterrence that we're hoping to get at. But we can't just put all of our eggs in the military basket, even if it is a very important basket.
Right.
Charles, I wanted to go back to China. China has sent record planes with 71 in across all over Taiwan right after Christmas Day. Do you see that continuing, and what will it take, as Legislator Lo mentioned, for Taiwan to deter China, to make China think twice before Xi Jinping pushes that war button?
There's a lot. We know the threat is obvious, and we need to work with our allies very closely, especially the United States. The bilateral relation between the United States and Taiwan now is getting much stronger right now. We can see the United States provide us, from NDAA 2023, there's $2 billion, we call it loans, try to help us to equip ourselves, to equip Taiwan as we call porcupine islands to purchase weapons. And also, not only security, like Lev mentioned, we also work with the United States very closely about economics. TSMC is going to invest in Arizona to produce electric chips for the international societies. So combining with security and economics, I think it's a very good combination of we call the international cooperation for Taiwan.
But it's interesting you mentioned economics, because we've seen with Xi Jinping with COVID-0, it seems like there was a huge hole in terms of Xi's consideration of the economy. Do you feel that when it comes to Taiwan, he'll consider that?
Taiwan, we are famous for the electronics industries and also high standards industries. And international society now, they pay attention to Taiwan's positions. Once if Taiwan has any kind of military attacks, they will intervene we call the supply chain or electronic parts.
But it wouldn't be that he'll put national security above the economy just to get Taiwan.
They will see, because it's in the future. We need to look at what he will do for the next few years, since now he's a strong man, control all the power in his hands.
I wanted to switch back to Lev for a little bit over here, because we heard President Tsai's announcement, and we're seeing that there is going to be a military reform going back to an extension of 1 year. Like you said, these are all the programs we're improving, and this is a great sign. But how do you think this action may also impact, let's say, the current Vice President William Lai? Let's say if he were to run for a presidential election in 2024, how do you think this extension may be an impact on him?
Right, so there's a few factors at play here. First is that Tsai stepped down as party chair, which means that there's now a vacancy in the DPP, and it's known that William Lai plans to run for that position of party chair in January. It's also no secret that he's the front runner for the DPP to be the next presidential candidate for 2024. And that's a little over a year away from now, and that's not a whole lot of time for us to really know how these programs will function. Because again, these programs need to be rolled out, people need to go through the program,
it will take time.
And then we need to look back. Now that's not enough time for us to really be able to evaluate whether or not it's a good program or not. So instead, we're going to have to be going off of public opinion on how we feel the program might be. Now this puts William Lai in a difficult position, because that means that it's going to be a lot more about how the potential program is framed rather than the program itself. And I anticipate that in the lead up to the next election, it's going to be a lot of public opinion polls looking at how Taiwanese civil society sees this extension in conscription. And until we really have a good understanding about how civil society is responding, that we're not going to be able to know exactly how much this is going to help or hurt William Lai. Now, in terms of timing, it is good for William Lai that Tsai Ing-wen is the one to announce this program.
Right.
Because this, at the very least, puts it on her. In the event that it is not unanimously approved of, it will fall more on her than on him, which, when it comes to the next presidential election, is good for him. But if it is a success, then William Lai will still be able to say, I was vice president, and I was there when it happened. So strategically, it's smart timing on behalf of the DPP. But with only a year before the election, it's just not enough time to really know if the program itself will win or lose the DPP approval points.
But do you think he would probably even have strengthened the whole program, or might even have a more extreme measures for military defense, do you think?
Given that we've known that there's been discussion about increasing the length of conscription for quite some time, and that after all this time, just keep in mind the war in Ukraine has been going on for quite some time, so I have to imagine that this discussion is not new, but rather ongoing. After all this time that it got to 1 year, I don't think that if William Lai becomes president, he's going to be able to just immediately create another extended program right away. At the same time, we've seen responses from the KMT in terms of how they see this new extension to conscription. And the KMT party has said that they fully approve of these changes. But you have people in the KMT like Zhao Shaokang talking about how he does not approve of the changes. And he says that if the KMT comes back into power, that they would roll back the changes. But again, that's not something you can just snap your fingers and do magically.
Right.
I think that the intention behind this 1 year extension is going to be a much, we would say, stickier institution, meaning hard to change right away, regardless of who the future president is.
Speaking of the KMT, do you feel that's a minor voice in terms of scrapping this program, or do you feel mainstream KMT is more similar to what the DPP administration is doing?
I believe mainstream KMT voice is similar in its support for these kinds of reforms. And I think that Zhao's comments are much more niche than they are mainstream. Because again, whether or not you adhere to the DPP's politics or the KMT's politics, I think, based off public opinion polls, we know that unification with the PRC is the least popular political position in Taiwan. Regardless of if you're KMT or DPP, you reject unification with the PRC. So knowing that, the idea of increasing deterrence from unification is going to be something that everyone in Taiwan will likely be in favor of. It's just going to be a matter of nitpicking on how we go about employing these deterrence plans. So I do expect the KMT will have critiques for the DPP, but it's going to be in the substance of these extensions, not in the extensions themselves.
Charles, do you have any take on this?
Since you mentioned Zhao Shaokang, he also, I think, he posted on Facebook about if KMT get back to the power.
Right.
He will, the KMT will, change the military service policy again. They'll change back to the 4 months because they know a lot of young people, they don't want to serve in the army, right? And now a lot of young people, especially senior, the high school students, they are whining. They say, "Oh, my summer vacation is gone.
Totally ruined."
Total ruined. They want to spend summer to do summer intern, to get a part-time job. They don't want to serve in the army. So this is why we need to pay attention to the polls. The people who support the polls, they already, for example, they already finished the army. They finished the services. But if you look into the polls of young people in Taiwan who are going to serve in the army, there's a strong opposition against this kind of extension of military services. And this is why Pan Blue camp, now they're still using this card to run for the 2024 elections.
So you think it's a ploy to get younger voters to come in?
When the government announced the new policies, you see a lot of voices online about from the young people, from especially I think the second year in high school students. They are kind of very, very careful, and they are pay attention to what they're gonna finish the military training in the future. Some people say, oh, you can spend like 4 times serve in the militaries during your college, which means you will go to the military service every summer. And do you think it's a possible way and doable way for college kids to do this? Because they probably want to spend summer to do the internship or go study abroad.
But as we all know here, whatever sovereign state that we're talking about, military defense definitely is very important, correct? So with all these younger people who haven't served in the army yet, they're not very happy with this new reformation. How do you think this may hurt a country / Taiwan in general, that their opinions may be hurting the future military defense measures?
So I think it's important to keep in mind that since the rollout, we don't have public opinion on how people feel about these measures. So even though I think there are certainly plenty of young voices that have come out in opposition, how all young people across Taiwan feel, we don't know yet.
What are your students saying? Are they?
So we didn't even talk about it in class this week, which could be a sign of either it's not registering for them that gravely, or they just didn't want to talk about it. But it really is going to be a matter of seeing how polls in response to this measure reflect civil society's opinions. And it's also important to keep in mind that we know that parties are gunning for young people's votes, but this kind of word "young people" in Taiwan there's more difference in young people's attitudes than we think. So, if you're under the age of 40, there's a difference between millennials and Gen Z. And assuming that all young people are going to feel the same, I think is not necessarily true.
Okay.
Furthermore, we know that young people actually vote the least in Taiwan. And this is true of all democracies.
Right.
So, this isn't great for young people because they're the ones that have to go serve in the military. But, looking forward to elections, even if they're competing over young people's votes, that's still not the demographic that's going to win elections.
Okay, so we just talked about how this extension will really enhance Taiwan's deterrence capabilities amid China's growing aggression, with record daily incursions of PLA aircraft in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and what exactly it means for the ruling party. So coming up next, we will hear from Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, on how the U.S. government and military circles are perceiving this reform, and what message Taiwan is sending to like-minded allies.
Welcome back to the show. Let's now hear from Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, a prominent think tank in America's capital. Cronin is a former senior military and foreign service officer and longtime researcher of Korea defense and East Asia. He shared with me how the U.S. government and defense analysts view this extension. Let's take a look.
We often talk about the need for the United States to reassure allies and partners about the U.S. commitment. But just as important, especially from the United States perspective, is that our partners are fully committed to their own self-defense, to their own welfare. And improving defense in Taiwan starts with creating and showing the political commitment that you're willing to defend your interests. And there's nothing more obvious than increasing the conscription length back to a year.
Patrick is a longtime Korea expert. Can you talk about how this compares to South Korea's conscription?
Obviously, South Korea has to continue to deter North Korea from attacking South Korea, and that threat is growing. At the same time, South Korea is just issued a new Indo-Pacific strategy to show that it is truly a global pivotal state. I think Taiwan also has to focus first and foremost on deterrence and peace across the Taiwan Strait, but it can play a larger role too. I think the conscription length is not sufficient, to be honest. I think it's an important step, maybe the crucial first step back toward a serious conscription that shows Taiwan is committed. But in Korea, there's a longer length of conscription.
In terms of Taiwan having a larger global role, President Tsai also mentioned in the announcement that Russia is increasing its military capabilities, posing a threat to the global security order. Do you see Taiwan's role increase with this announcement?
Well, Taiwan does play a global role, as we know, just through semiconductors alone being so critical. The production comes largely out of Taiwan for all the high-end semiconductors. But beyond that, Taiwan plays a crucial role as a major developed economy and a democracy. When you're dealing with a major outlaw action like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's a role for a lot of states, including a role for Taiwan to play in supporting the humanitarian needs, the economic needs, the technological needs of those trying to defend against aggression, in this case, Russian aggression. I don't think Taiwan wants to make an enemy directly of anybody, including Russia, but at the same time, it has a high stake in the rules-based order. And that means putting down the lawlessness and brutal attack of countries like Russia is an interest and a capability for Taiwan that it can help support.
Speaking of Russia, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, how do you draw comparisons between Taiwan and Ukraine, given Ukraine's show of its determination to defend the homeland?
I think there's no, again, more important indicator of the ability to execute your own self-defense to convince the world, the international community, that your cause is not a lost one, but one that can be supported, and that you're going to find ready support, not just from the United States and Europe, but from around the world, if you are the victim of aggression. And I think Ukraine, so clearly the victim of major aggression this past February when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and at the same time, the willingness for the Ukrainians to step in and fight regardless of the enormous and tremendous costs and tragedy, really galvanized the international community around Ukraine. And I think for Taiwan, things like the action of a year-long conscription being reenacted is something that will demonstrate to the world that if Taiwan is ever attacked, it will have the international community support against that aggression.
Patrick, you mentioned that this is a first significant step. What's next?
Well, I think there's a larger ethos or mindset change underway in Taiwan right now that President Tsai is trying to implement. And I think it has to deal with the fact that the territorial defense, the economic security of Taiwan, the political security of Taiwan, first and foremost is a Taiwan matter. And that therefore, conscription shows that they're willing to do their bit in terms of uniform and fill critical gaps in military personnel, but they need to, through civil defense training, through greater economic security policies, make sure they have the resilient economy, a ready civil defense, and also a more ready defense against aggression, to not take the offense against any aggressor, but rather to make sure they can defend Taiwan territory.
You just heard Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, speak to Rath on what message this extension sends to the U.S., how it compares with South Korean conscription, and Taiwan's increased role on the world stage. Let's now discuss the specifics of how Taiwan's conscription compares with other countries in the region. As we can see here, conscription in South Korea is approximately 18 to 21 months, whereas Singapore is 2 years, and it's even longer in Israel. So Charles, I would like to ask, as we saw earlier on a computer graphic, Singapore and South Korea, they have longer conscription period, whereas we're just running from 4 months to an extension of 1 year. Do you think 1 year is even enough?
Like what I say, when I served in the Army, it's about 1.5 years. Mm-hmm. But what we did is only prone shooting positions. And except that we didn't have any kind of other shooting training for like kneeling down or even standing positions. Mm-hmm. However, if you want to send the guys to the battlefield, you need to give them more techniques, right, and more skills to fighting. So this is one thing I think we not only try to extend from 4 months to 1 year, we also need to change, also improve the contents of our training. Mm-hmm. This is the most important things. Yes. And the second thing I want to mention is about the international cooperation and also the assistance from the United States.
Right.
We know the United States give a lot of help, especially we know nowadays they just passed the DAA. Even people argue whether they give loans or grants. The appropriation committee only give us loans. But I think the financial support is real, and also they will keep going, sending to Taiwan in the future. Mm-hmm. But it's very important to think how to cooperate with the United States and also other allies in the region, especially Japan, United States, and Taiwan. Mm-hmm. We know the trilateral cooperation was very rare before. However, now people are talking about how these three countries, with like-minded countries, they can cooperate in security issues and also security cooperations. Mm-hmm. For example, some people say the United States should strengthen and also improve their weapon system and also survivability in Japan. Mm-hmm. In order to face potential attacks from China, United States need to improve and also kind of strengthen their military support to Japan. And also the Taiwan, United States, and Japan, how the three sides to communicate to each other, actually to work together. We know the United States and Japan, they have very long time cooperation, we call the OPCOM, the operational control for a long time. However, Taiwan, United States, and Japan, we don't have this kind of system.
Do you feel that there could be where Japan would bring Taiwan into the picture with the U.S.?
Now people are talking and suggest probably more this kind of meetings, seminars, conference between the three sides, either government officials or not government officials, or the two tracks, including scholars, retired military personnel. They can meet together and talk about these issues. Some think tanks in the United States, they have started this kind of cooperations. However, we will see how far this kind of cooperative mechanism can go. And third thing is very important is how the United States can improve this kind of channel for the military to military communication with Taiwan and Japanese militaries. I think this is a very important key point in the future when we look at this kind of regional cooperation framework. I do believe if Taiwan want to work with like-minded countries, especially we call democratic countries, why democracy they don't fight war against each other? Because they know the culture with each other. They know they have a strong check and balance system in domestic politics. So this is very hard for democracy to fight against each other. However, democracy and non-democracy, they fight like cats and dogs. So this is why Biden, when he stepped to the power, he said you want to use the hub and spoke structures to bring all the democratic allies in East Asia to work together. They have a theoretical background on this.
Speaking of domestic politics, Lev, there seems to be a bit of a upheaval in terms of grants or either loans with the NDAA. Do you feel that 100% loans as the outcome came out because of U.S. public support or sentiment in terms of how the U.S. will support Taiwan?
So we've seen in recent polls in the United States that support from the U.S. public for Taiwan is higher than it's ever been. At the same time, we just had a midterm election in the United States, and we've kind of seen a new level of hawkishness towards China across both Democratic and Republican parties. So we know that, from Taiwan's perspective, this is a good moment for Taiwan because U.S. politicians have never been more committed to writing and passing productive Taiwan policy. So from Taiwan's perspective, I think this shows that U.S. support is not only as strong as it was before, but it's more likely to maintain or become even stronger given that Taiwan is becoming increasingly popular in the United States as a foreign policy issue.
So what explains the $2 billion or that we've seen disappear in terms of grants becoming loans?
I think it's difficult to say. A lot of these policy decisions are going to be a lot of sort of black boxes that we're never going to know what goes in. And with something as sensitive as Taiwan policy, we're not going to know what gets cut and what does not, and who's pushing for these cuts.
Right.
So if you look in the past at some of these previous Taiwan bills, usually how Taiwan bills start is far more provocative in terms of what their desired outcomes would be. And then usually US politicians slowly trim them back to a more pragmatic and moderate level. And I anticipate we saw a similar outcome here, where there was the intention was always good. It's just a matter about finding the balance that allows Taiwan to defend itself in a defensive manner. And it's this phrase, in a defensive manner, that's meaningful because part of the Taiwan Relations Act talks about the U.S.'s obligation to sell weapons to Taiwan in a defensive capability. So the U.S.'s responsibility is defensive in nature, not offensive in nature. And I think it's a matter of making sure that our military commitments to Taiwan reflect what the Taiwan Relations Act stipulates.
And I want to go back to you a little bit because there's a stronger public sentiment of the U.S. and Taiwan relationship, as you just mentioned earlier. And also, especially American Institute in Taiwan actually showed a statement of support right after the President Tsai's announcement. So how do you think this one-year extension, do you think the U.S. also has impact on this decision?
Absolutely. I mentioned a little bit about this before, but from the United States perspective, it's really important to see that Taiwanese are actively participating in deterrence. Part of the reason why some people feel that strategic ambiguity still has value is because the United States doesn't want Taiwan to feel like it has a blank check, that it can entirely rely on the United States, and that no matter what happens, the United States will send boots on the ground to Taiwan to defend Taiwan. That's very unlikely to happen, and the United States does not want Taiwan to become that comfortable with the idea that the United States' support for Taiwan during a military conflict would be so grand, because it would likely not be. So for the sake of kind of reminding the United States that Taiwan cares about its deterrence from within its own domestic politics, these kinds of conscription extensions are an important signal to the United States. It shows the United States that Taiwan is actively taking charge to make sure that it's capable of defending itself and not entirely relying on the United States.
And just on a side note, because both Lev and Charles, you're all professors at NCCU, so you actually approach a lot of Taiwanese students here. And we also mentioned strategic ambiguity. And it is very important. But at the same time, I feel like somehow it may also hurt Taiwan a little bit because we rely on the US so much. So if things were really going to happen, let's say if there is really going to be a war, do you think Taiwanese younger generation or people that you approach here at National Chengchi University or universities other places in Taiwan, most people might still think that we can rely 100% on the US? Do people have that mindset at all?
I think there are some people who genuinely feel that we don't need to spend all this money on defense because the United States will come and help us no matter what. And I think that's perhaps, I'm glad that people feel so positive that the United States will help, but I worry that that's perhaps a bit overstated on their end. And it's important to remember, even though the United States has shown nothing but strong commitments to to Taiwan, and I firmly believe that this strong relationship will continue. Things like selling military packages in a with defensive capabilities are popular. Sending American troops to Taiwan is a qualitative change in policy that is an entire different bag of worms that domestically in the United States, I don't think any president would be willing to commit to.
Although President Biden mentioned it 4 times. So.
For this one, I have data. It's the data from Chicago Council on Global Affairs, just published in 2022, July. And the poll asked American citizens, would you sending arms or military equipment to Taiwan? Either or. Guess, about 76% of American citizens say we prefer sending arms to Taiwan. Only 40% they favor sending U.S. ground troops to Taiwan, which means the American people now, they think giving weapons for Taiwan is much better than sending their own troops to Taiwan to help them to fight. They want Taiwanese to fight and win the war if there's a war occurred.
Right.
Okay, if the poll is real, then we come back to look at Taiwanese society, where the Taiwanese society, Taiwanese citizens, they trust the United States commitments. I think the TDS, they do the same poll before. They say whether you believe the United States will send the troops to Taiwan once there's a war occurs. I think more than 50%, the poll shows more than 50% of Taiwanese people, they don't trust the United States was sending the troops there. So this is a very interesting issue we need to study. To go back to the topic about whether strategic ambiguity is still available or still a kind of helpful strategy. Some people say, oh, even Biden pledged 4 times he will send the troops to Taiwan once the war occurs.
So what's behind his statement?
I think people say that he just used a more clear way to elaborate strategic ambiguity.
It's a diplomatic measure.
Strategic ambiguity is still the principle, however, the tactic is a more clear way to say that.
Right, right.
Because it's very dangerous when you try to open the Pandora box in this East Asia. You want to make sure all the allies in this area, you get ready.
Right.
South Korea need to get ready, Japan need to get ready, Australian people need to get ready. If there we go back to realist, with the nature of war in these areas. It's not only the Taiwan and United States issues, it's everybody's issues, right?